Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
This is Initiated Survivor, where we share survivors' voices and our stories of recovery and reclaiming our power. I'm Kelsey Harper. I'm a clinical psychologist and a survivor, and I like to share helpful tips and skills about recovery from trauma. As a community of survivors, we have tremendous power to change the world, so thank you so much for being here. Here we discuss stories and information that is relevant to survivors of gender-based violence and sexual violence. These topics may be triggering and are for adult ears only, so please be mindful of your needs throughout. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Initiated Survivor. I'm going to talk to you today about emotional support animals. This is something that I get asked about a lot in my practice. We see it all over the place of people using emotional support animals or ESAs as part of taking care of their mental health, their trauma. And I just want to answer some questions about what it is, how do you get one, and are they even helpful? So the first thing is an emotional support animal is an animal that has been designated by either a therapist, psychologist, physician, a doctor, somebody in a healthcare profession to be serving a purpose for supporting the emotional and mental well-being of a person. And there is a specific letter that has to be written in order for the animal to be classified as an emotional support animal. And therefore, there are certain rights then afforded to the person and the animal under certain policies. Now, what's different about this is that an ESA is not a service animal. There are service animals that are psychiatric service animals that are specifically trained to serve very specific purposes for mental health issues. The service animals are similar to like seeing eye dogs or medical alert dogs. These are dogs that have gone through a tremendous amount of very specific certified training to perform very specific tasks. And then also the human is trained to be able to work with the dog specifically to meet some of these needs. And that is protected under the American with Disabilities Act. That is very different than an ESA. An ESA is simply an animal that a therapist, a psychologist, or some sort of healthcare provider has deemed necessary to take care of your mental health. That does not mean that the animal has received any training. Often it means that they have not received any training. And there's no training that the human is going to go through to be able to work with the animal. So what is the purpose of an ESA? I think, for folks that have animals, it can be rather obvious. Animals actually do really effectively help us regulate our emotions. We do have research that backs that up. And that's why this specific designation with having certain protections around it came up, was because we had research that showed that people with depression, with anxiety, with trauma actually showed tremendous amount of improvement in their symptoms by having animals, whether that was a dog or cat, a pet of some sort that they took care of, that this pet didn't have to actually perform any specific tasks in order for those symptoms to change, to improve. And it makes a lot of sense. What we see is people with depression, when they have emotional support animals like dogs or cats, they're able to better care for themselves because they're having to take care of this animal. And so routine is much easier to establish. Oftentimes, folks are able to actually become more social. They're less isolated. They're not feeling so lonely. Their mood is not getting as low because they are interfacing and interacting with this animal. But also sometimes animals invite other people to us. Like when we're out walking our dogs, people will inevitably come up and talk to us. My introverted self doesn't really appreciate that trait very much, but very helpful for isolation. And also it does force us to get out of the house and do certain things. One of the things that's really helpful about ESAs or animals and how they support our mental health is that they help keep our mental focus and our mental gaze on things outside of ourselves. And so depression and anxiety can keep our mind very, very focused internally on our sensations, our emotions, what's going on in our life. Having an animal that we're taking care of does force our mind to shift a little bit in its mindfulness and its focus, and that can help really reduce some of those symptoms around rumination, depressed mood, anxiety, excessive worrying, that kind of thing. And oftentimes that focus that's on ourselves during depression and anxiety is really unintentional. It's not a deliberate effort, and that you just have to quote unquote think about something else. And that's why having an animal is really helpful, because an animal kind of comes in and really helps move that focus because we are not able to change that ourselves. And so emotional support support animals are really powerful and effective for helping support people with being able to function in their day-to-day life, being able to recover from things much quicker, and also to prevent depression and anxiety from getting super, super deep and low. An emotional support animal is also really helpful and powerful because they're cute, they're adorable, they bring joy, bring fun, they help us practice certain skills like getting outside, getting to be around people, communicating, taking care of things and taking care of ourselves, as well as just doing things that are around joy, fun, and comfort. So why do people get ESAs? People get ESAs because they help, they work. The other reason that we see a lot of people get ESAs is because despite that, the majority of people have pets or want to have pets, or at the very least are going to have animals come into their life in some way, like maybe their friend has a pet that they bring over and visit with. A lot of housing does not allow pets, of any kind into the unit, into the apartment, into the house, whatever it might be, usually out of interest of trying to protect any possible damage that happens. And as housing has become less and less affordable, and therefore more and more people are renting rather than purchasing, being able to set their own rules for their house, we've seen that more and more people have not been able to get animals. And so a law came in to say that if an animal is deemed as necessary for somebody's mental health care, an emotional support animal, then an apartment complex, a property manager, a landlord, an owner cannot deny that animal access into that house. And that was incredibly important and very valuable because now we have a lot of people who are using mental health services, who are needing mental health care, who are able to have animals that are helping their symptoms improve significantly. The other thing that's really important about this is that it makes animals that are really supportive for mental health much more accessible to people. Service animals, because of the amount of training that they have and how specific they are, one, are very, very expensive. It takes a very long time to get a service animal. Oftentimes you have to apply and be approved, and that process can sometimes take years. So we can see that service animals are actually really, really difficult to access. And, it makes sense because there's a lot of time and energy and effort that goes into it. And also they're very expensive. And so what this does is this allows people to be able to still access some of the benefits of having an animal, particularly for our mental health symptoms, without having to go through all of that process, save up a ton of money, having to apply, go through training, all of that kind of stuff, that they can adopt an animal in one way, shape, or form and get some approval from their therapist that it's going to be helpful for them. And that makes it so that many people can then use animals as supportive creatures for them, which is really wonderful. So why ESAs? Why is this important? Why is this valuable? Like I said, they reduce a lot of people's symptoms. We have research that backs that up. It's incredibly valuable and important. It is different than a service animal, and that's okay. But ESAs actually do have a profound impact on people's mental health. Now, particularly for folks with trauma, ESAs, emotional support animals, can really help people when they are having flashbacks, when they are having intrusive thoughts or memories, because it pulls their mind and their focus back into the present moment. ESAs can really help people with regulating their emotions by performing soothing things, sitting with them, getting into comforting positions and comforting interactions, that kind of thing, going out on walks, getting exercise, getting activity. And so we see that ESAs can really help with recovery from trauma in tremendous amounts of ways. Now, one of the things that often comes up when we talk about ESAs is the frustration that people are calling pretty much anything and everything an ESA. This conversation has revolved a lot around particularly flights and airplanes and people bringing animals onto airplanes, and that story about someone who tried to bring an emotional support peacock on an airplane, that kind of thing. And that is one of the spaces that you are allowed to bring an ESA because airplanes can be a really difficult place for people. The thing that occurs to me around this is that oftentimes when we try to gatekeep something, only these kinds of people with these kinds of needs can have emotional support animals and only these kinds of animals can be emotional support animals. While all of that is true and valid, that we want somebody to have an emotional support animal that is helpful and effective for them, that when we tend to put in a lot of restrictions, the people who suffer those restrictions the most tend to be marginalized people without access to the things that they need. that the people who could bring a dog onto an airplane, whether it was an ESA or not, is not going to have a hard time with those restrictions and likely is going to find another way around them. But somebody who maybe really needs an ESA, and financially isn't able to afford like a service animal, wants to bring that animal onto an airplane and is facing a lot of criticism or restrictions about it, and inevitably also still has to be able to meet with a therapist willing to write them a letter, and that also costs time and money, they're most likely actually to not be able to have access to emotional support animals, to the services that they could get that would support them. So, while it can be frustrating to see people bring animals into places where it feels like it's inappropriate for that, or that they declare all animals are service animals or emotional support animals when we believe that they're not, when there's evidence that there's not. The issue is more that our world isn't effectively accessible for everybody, not that the people who need accessibility are not being discerning enough. We don't want to restrict folks that need accessibility. We want to make the world more accessible. And so that would be where I would maybe think about putting my focus is, how do I make ESAs more accessible to folks, and how do we make it more possible for this to be an effective intervention for them? So how do people get an ESA? Like I said, one of the easiest and quickest ways is to get a letter from your therapist. Now, there are times when people are specifically just wanting an ESA. So they start therapy with a therapist, immediately ask for a letter, and then cancel and end therapy. That is not the most effective route, particularly because if at any point people are asking for more information about the ESA, more documentation, all of that kind of stuff, you don't have anyone to provide that for you. It's also really tough to make an argument that you need an ESA if you're not in therapy. And again, though, that is a restriction that makes it less and less accessible for people who need it. So the easiest way to get an ESA is to talk to your doctor or talk to your therapist. Your therapist is most likely to be able to write a letter identifying that you meet qualifications or criteria for needing an ESA, and that, the animal that you have is your emotional support animal. Is there anything that the animal needs to do or to possess to be able to be a good emotional support animal? Yes and no. One is that the animal needs to be one that you can take with you places, in the sense that you feel good having this animal around, which seems kind of obvious. You wouldn't adopt an animal that you don't want around, but there are some animals that require a lot of care and a lot of attention and require a lot of training. They've come from their own traumatic upbringings as well. And those might not be the best as an ESA, because if you're going through a mental health crisis, your animal may not be in a place to be able to support you if they are also needing a lot of regulation too. So you want to have an animal that feels like they are able to regulate themselves, requires minimal training, that kind of thing, and you feel good and calm in their presence and having them around. Also, an animal that you are actively taking care of. This isn't like someone else's animal. This isn't a family member's animal. This is your animal, someone that is living with you, that you are taking care of, that you are responsible for. The other is that you're wanting an animal that also, for the most part, is about an adult. Puppies can be a really, really tough ESA because, again, they have really high needs. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for anyone with anxiety or anyone with sensory integration issues or autism spectrum. Having a puppy as an ESA might be really hard because they're unpredictable and have high needs. With that said, having a puppy who has high needs could actually be really helpful for someone with depression who is needing to get motivated and mobilized, and a puppy may help with that. There definitely has to be some assessment around that, with the therapist maybe helping facilitate that around, are the needs of the puppy too much or just enough to get that person mobilized? If they're too much, it's not going to be helpful for the person or for the puppy. Cats and kittens are also really great ESAs. Very similarly, we want to make sure that the cat is going to be mindful and present with the human, is somebody that the human connects with, and also ideally not a kitten with really high needs as well. And so then what you do is you meet with your therapist, and if you feel like this is something that would really work for you, you just ask, what do you think about me getting an ESA? Can we talk about, registering one of my animals as an ESA? There isn't really a registration. You just get a letter from your therapist. Most therapists do have a template that they would easily be able to fill out with your information and offer you so that you can have your animal as an official ESA. And your therapist is going to ask you some things like, what is this animal doing for you? How is it that they're helping you? And mostly that's just to make sure that the animal is actually providing a service for you and is actually working, in the sense that if the animal that you have that you're trying to make an ESA is not actually serving the needs that you need it, you might need to adopt another one or get a different animal, that kind of things, to make sure that it's a good fit. There's also many times where people will seek out getting an ESA letter prior to adopting an animal. I think that can be a really great idea because you can discuss with your therapist what kind of traits and behaviors you would like to see that animal possess. Here's one very emotionally supportive animal. That's Timmy. Very supportive, but not an ESA. And so, checking out with a therapist, like what would be a good ESA for you before you adopt an animal would be absolutely perfect. We also know that that perfect world doesn't exist for many people. And oftentimes we already have animals in our lives that are serving that purpose. And that's wonderful too. And we can write those letters. Can I have more than one ESA? Here's something that's really interesting that I don't think many people know. Yes, you can have more than one ESA. The way you go about this, though, is that your ESAs, having multiple of them, they have to serve different purposes. So, for example, a dog is going to help get you out of the house. It's going to help prevent isolation. It's going to help you stay active and mobilized in that way by getting exercise outside. And, another ESA, whether that's another dog or a cat or a guinea pig, may actually be more emotional and sensory soothing, with being able to pet the animal, being able to sit quietly with the animal, and we'll see emotion regulation that serves another purpose there. So you actually can have more than one ESA as long as they are doing different things for you. And, animals can serve a number of purposes around caring for our emotional well-being. So that actually isn't too difficult to demonstrate or to prove. Where can I take my ESA, my emotional support animal? And again, being clear, emotional support animals are not service animals. And so that means that the protections around service animals do not apply to ESAs. So there are specific spaces that you can take an ESA where the ESA will be protected by the law. This doesn't mean that you can't take them at any other place. It just means that somebody could, step in and be like, no, take that animal out of here. And there's no law that's going to protect you to demand that they stay. So the two main places where ESAs have protected rights are in apartments and homes that you live in, that you either have a lease or you own, and or on an airplane or any kind of public travel, with the idea that the ESA is performing a certain service for you. So specifically on an airplane, the animal has the right to be outside of its carrier so that it is helping take care of your needs, your emotional needs, your mental health needs on the airplane. In the apartment that you're renting, in a house that you're renting or that you own, the emotional support animal is allowed to live there without any restrictions and without any additional charges. And in the sense of having to pay more rent or something like that, because sometimes it's another way that people will interfere with people being able to have pets, is to expect either a pet rent or pet deposit, that kind of stuff, additional fees. Those are the two spaces where emotional support animals are protected. Does this mean you can't bring them elsewhere? No, you can definitely bring them elsewhere. It just means that if you take your ESA to the grocery store and the grocery store comes up to you and says, hey, no, you have to leave your dog out in the car, you may actually have to do that. That there isn't necessarily a law protecting you the way that there are laws protecting service animals, that service animals can go anywhere that a human needs to go. With that said, again, I haven't necessarily seen too many issues with people bringing their emotional support animals into different public spaces and, been refused much service. The other is to be really mindful that your emotional support animal is itself a creature. And so they also have their own temperament, their own needs, and their own mental health issues as well. And so you may want to be mindful that you're taking your ESA into places that are not going to trigger the animal or be overwhelming for the animal. And you also are wanting to take them to places specifically where they're helping you, where they can be helpful to you, and also it's not overwhelming for them. So if you don't need your ESA at a restaurant, I wouldn't recommend bringing the ESA to the restaurant. If you do, if you have social anxiety, you can check with a restaurant if they are animal friendly. There are many that are. and feel free to bring your animal. And that could actually be a wonderful experience to help regulate some of your social anxiety with your ESA, while you're out and about in public. So being mindful of those different things. Again, it doesn't mean that you can't take your ESA into those other spaces. It just means that people have the right to have boundaries around that. I hope this was helpful for you. This is one of the things that I get asked a lot about. I definitely love showcasing my animals and talking about how much they supported me in my recovery, particularly, my cats, Albert and Timmy, were really helpful in my trauma recovery around just providing me company. I didn't feel so alone. Also allowed me a lot of structure and gave me a lot of structure in some space. It made it really difficult to dissociate. So I was much more mindfully present. And then it was shortly after that I adopted my dog, Neville, my little white therapy floof. You'll see in photos and on my website. He's adorable and wonderful. None of these animals are official ESAs. I haven't needed to actually get letters for them in order to be able to have them with me, which is really powerful and helpful that there's been a lot more accessibility with animals. But they also have served some very important purposes for me. Neville really helped me get out of the house and practice going outside when being outside of my home was incredibly triggering. When I wasn't going any place except my home and work and back again, to the point of like ordering groceries, not really running many errands, him having to go out on walks and me going with him and, experiencing some of that exposure and regulating some of that anxiety and being outside and getting accustomed to the sounds and the noises and to the feeling of being outside really helped reduce that anxiety and that avoidance that I was feeling. And I started to feel much more free to do other things in my life. He also has helped me at times when I've had really bad flashbacks or really bad triggers where he will jump on my lap and lick my face. And it's a way of getting back grounded into the present moment. He's very comforting and will sit and lay with me and keep watch over me if I'm going through something really tough. And that has been incredibly, incredibly helpful. I usually credit Neville with fully helping transform my life in really important ways, as well as Albert and Timmy. You've probably also seen lately that I have a new teeny tiny little Chihuahua. She is adorable and sweet as well. She's still new. I've only had her for, about 8 months now at this point. So we're still getting to know her little personality, but she is very sweet, very cuddly, and very comforting as well. And so I highly recommend looking into emotional support animals if you're a survivor, if you're recovering from trauma, if you find it hard to get out and about, or if you find it hard to emotionally regulate on your own, even if you're just having a hard time performing some basic self-care practices, getting an animal to help teach you those practices is going to be really, really helpful and powerful. And that is actually a wonderful task for an ESA to support you with. So I'd love to hear from everybody about what you thought of this, if you have ESAs, how animals have helped you, even if they're not ESAs. And yeah, I will see you again soon. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to Sam Valentine and her team at Fast Forward Productions for editing, producing, publishing, and all-around podcast magic that makes this podcast possible. If you found something that resonated with you, please rate and review on your favorite podcast platform. This simple but meaningful action really helps increase the visibility and accessibility of this podcast to survivors and allies that may be looking for some support and connection. I love connecting with listeners and allies, so please feel free to share this episode on your socials and go ahead and tag me in it at Initiated Survivor or at Kelsey J. Harper. A final but very important note. While I am a clinical psychologist, this episode and this podcast does not constitute professional mental health care or therapy, nor is it a replacement for professional therapy. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The podcast host and the guests are not rendering professional advice and should not be considered to have developed a professional relationship. If you are looking for mental health care or professional help, please seek it out. We have some links in the show notes that may help you with that, or you can contact your insurance carrier directly for referrals.